I don't know a lot about World War I other than what I've read in history books and novels. I just am hoping to find out more about where my grandfather was specifically and where he fought.
It would have been a very thrilling experience for him. This was a new kind of war. This was a war of change.
Took us from the horses and buggies and wagons to trucks and scout cars and ambulances.
He was gassed and wasn't in very good shape.
This was the first time gas had been used in modern warfare. And as a final saying, he put Gott mit uns, in German, God with us.
I don't have a lot of memories of my grandfather. I only knew my grandfather for about 6 years before he died. He died in 1963, and I was 6 years old at the time. I only have a few memories of my grandfather. He struck me as a very reticent or very quiet man. Although he had some wit about him, he used it sparingly. He was a farmer. He worked extremely hard. You know, he had some livestock. He grew corn, beans.
If we get a load of corn, time to walk to school, we walked. If we didn't, Dad had a old Dodge truck that he let us drive to school, and we thought we were something because the other kids had ponies tied to the fence.
The only way I knew about my grandfather's war experience was just general comments that were made throughout my childhood, whether it be from my grandmother or my father. Very little was said about my grandfather's World War I experience.
He's pretty quiet. He didn't talk much about it. He was gassed. He wasn't in too much combat after being gassed. That's about all I know about what he did, but he was gassed and wasn't in very good shape. It made him a different person, I think, the service did, as far as I can remember.
It's been a real adventure trying to find more information out, especially about my grandfather, and pretty difficult, really, to find specifics out about his background and where he was and where he fought. There was very minimal about my grandfather's war experience that I was exposed to. There was a helmet that he wore during World War I that we still have, and that's in the Livingston County War Museum. And we also found his gas mask. It wasn't in the greatest of shape, but it's been almost 100 years since it was used. Right now, it's just a uniform on a mannequin. I'm looking to find out the story behind that uniform. Anybody who was involved in World War I is dead. So it's a little bit more difficult to pinpoint exactly the information that we need to tell his story. I don't know a lot about World War I other than what I've read in history books and novels. Luckily, I know a gentleman by the name of David Mumper who's from Ottawa, Illinois, which is my hometown, and he's a World War I expert, and he especially is knowledgeable about the unit that came from Ottawa that fought alongside my grandfather's unit, the 131st. I'm really looking forward to getting a start on finding out a little bit more about my grandfather's experience and where he was and what he did. How did you become interested in World War I?
After I got out of the service myself and came back to Ottawa, I had an uncle by marriage who was in World War I, and we would sit and talk, and he would talk about things in France. And as a result of that, he suggested that I start talking to some of the other World War I veterans that he personally knew, several of whom were with the 129th Infantry of the 33rd Division. So in 1972, I started interviewing quite a number of the veterans of the 129th, and I learned a lot from the veterans themselves. I feel very fortunate in the fact that I was able to do that I started this at a time when quite a number of them were still living. So I was able to get firsthand stories. To me, that's invaluable because many of the things that they told me are not things that you would normally read in the history books.
And their voices are silent now.
They've been gone, most of them, for some 30 years or more now. But fortunately, I did tape record many of them.
Today is December 5th, 1972, and this is a talk with Mr. William R. Milligan, who is bugler for Company C of the 129th Infantry.
If there's one thing for sure on my job, I didn't have to try to kill anybody.
Right.
You know, well, I'm telling you this much. No, I was never what you'd call a fanatic on religion. I made one prayer after I got over there that I would never have to kill anybody.
I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him up to be my pride and joy.
The song, I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, basically means exactly that. We are at peace. We don't need to be at war. Many of these people of the day remembered the Spanish-American War, which was basically a trumped-up war. And some also remembered the Civil War and its horrors. So that was reflected in the attitudes of the times, in that we don't need to go to war. My son doesn't need to shoot some other mother's darling boy, as the songs would say.
Everyone for liberty.
The music changed as the attitudes in the country changed, as we were drawn more and more closely into the tangled web of European treaties that fell apart.
Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere.
My grandfather, he was 28 years old by the time he was drafted. Being from the Midwest on a small farming community, what would it have been like for him to be uprooted for this war and go across the Atlantic and to fight in this war?
It would have been actually a very thrilling experience for him. He was inducted, which means he was drafted into the service. It was an adventure. For young fellows off the farm, it was a chance to get away. It was a chance to see something in the world, maybe the only chance they would ever have in their lifetime. They knew the risks that were involved. They knew that they would be provided with whatever was needed. They felt just in their cause.
And my grandfather was a member of the 131st Infantry of the 33rd Division, and I believe it was Company B. Can you give me some insight as to where the 131st Infantry originated?
The 131st was originally the 1st Illinois Regiment of the National Guard, the Illinois National Guard, headquartered in Chicago. They seem to have a great deal of financial backing in Chicago, and because of the ability for their unit to have the latest equipment, they became known as the Dandy First. So the 131st is what they became once the units were federalized and became part of the 33rd Division. The 131st was commanded by Colonel Sanborn, who had quite a large handlebar mustache and was quite an interesting man, but his men loved him.
The troops began calling him Holy Joe because of his, I believe, profane approach to leadership. At the ripe young age of 62, he allegedly saw one of his frontline units pinned down. They were running out of ammunition, and he personally carried the ammunition foxhole to foxhole to replenish the troops. So I have no idea if that story is apocryphal or if he actually did that, but well, I look in the mirror now at the same age he was carrying ammunition, and I'm like, could I do that? He's a tough old boy.
So you'll find quite a number of the senior officers had a lot of years of military experience, perhaps not combat experience, but at least military experience behind them.
Now I noticed that my grandfather, it was like, I believe May of 1918 is when he was drafted.
Yes.
Was that, and I noticed that our involvement in the war is later.
The largest number of divisions arrived in France in May and June of 1918. Once we got over there and we were able to fight as an American army, we were on the offensive.
David is a wealth of knowledge, specifically of World War I, but especially for the Illinois National Guard units that went over and fought in France and Germany. There is so much information that David's given me, it's overwhelming, and I think I need some visuals here.
I have here a map showing the operations of the 131st Infantry from the portfolio of maps that's part of the history of the 33rd Division. The 131st, of course, being part of the 33rd Division. Their insignia being a yellow cross on a black background. The 131st, as well as other units of the 33rd Division, were given the task of crossing the Meuse River between the little village of Donaveau and the small village of Consenvoy. Consenvoy was on the east side of the river. There was a bridge at Consenvoy across the Meuse. However, it had been destroyed by the Germans in their retreat. So the 108 engineers built numerous footbridges across the Meuse River under heavy machine gun fire, and your grandfather would have been one of the men of the 131st crossing one of the footbridges, going on into the Bois du Chem and up to the Bois Platchen. This is so interesting because your grandfather was in Company B of the 131st Infantry, which would have been the 1st Battalion. This circled area shows exactly where the 1st Battalion was located on October 10th. So that would have marked exactly where your grandfather was at the time he was gassed.
That's something.
The maps that he unrolled for me today were really the road maps for my understanding of where my grandfather was at and where he fought. He also mentioned that the conditions that my grandfather fought in.
Conditions in the trenches were very bad. Once they got into them, you lived in mud. You lived with rats constantly. They told of waking up with rats running across their faces at night. And the other thing, cooties. They had never dreamed of ever having cooties, body lice. The machine guns kept them pinned down as well as artillery. So when they did move out of the trenches, it was very deadly. Most of our casualties were caused by machine guns, artillery, or gas. This was the first time gas had been used in modern warfare. One of the men that I knew had walked through a patch of grass, and it was not long before he realized there had been mustard gas in that. Even well into his 80s, he rolled up his pant legs and showed me both of his calves were severely, his shins actually, were severely burned. You could still see the scars to that day.
When you're in battle, not being a veteran myself, I have no idea what goes through your mind in moments like that. You're probably just wanting to do your very best and get through with your life, you know, get through the experience with your life intact.
I also brought along today 2 gas masks. And this one was carried in the same battle where your grandfather was when he crossed the Meuse-Argonne. Many of the men on their masks wrote little sayings, and these stressed the importance of having your gas mask. This was very common for the men to do. I need thee every hour. I am your friend. Take care of me. Do not leave me behind. Corporal Duncan. And as a final saying, he put Gott mit uns, in German, God with us. When the alert was sounded, when the gas alarm went off, you removed your helmet, hung it by the strap on your arm, took the gas mask out, opened it up, which most of these, they were rubberized on the inside, and it's very difficult to see this, Roger. Mm-hmm. But you would put this mouthpiece in your mouth, you would place this spring-loaded clamp over your nose and attach all of the straps, which were an elastic material, over your head, fitting the mask to the curves of your face.
I was totally shocked by the amount of information that David had for me, especially the specifics about where my grandfather was fighting. He showed me artifacts, types of things that he would have been carrying with him into battle.
And each man had his pair of dog tags. In case one was mortally wounded or killed, one dog tag stayed with the body, the other went with the company commander, which was the same as what was done in World War II. But these items do give a little bit of an illustration of what those things were like that your grandfather would have carried and would have used. Amongst his personal belongings, when he came home, he would have had things very similar to this. This was a new kind of war. This was a war of change. Tanks, airplanes, yet we were using horses, mules. It was a war of blending the old with the new fighting methods.
What was really interesting is David was talking about the transition of warfare, moving from foot soldiers and cavalry, the use of horses, into a mechanized warfare, which was, tanks, Model Ts, ambulances, things of that nature. There's a gentleman here in this area, his name is John Krug, who has restored some of these vehicles, the originals from 100 years ago. And we get an opportunity to go out and see these vehicles just as they were when my grandfather was in World War I over in France.
Hi.
Drew, how are you?
Hi.
I'm Roger Amm.
Good. Nice to meet you, Roger.
John, Dave Mumper.
Dave, nice to meet you.
You
Yeah.
have quite a place here.
Thank you.
How many vehicles do you have? I didn't have any idea that you had this many.
Well, I probably have about 20 altogether. One of my favorite pieces is right there. The 1916 Scout car.
You've done a magnificent job on it.
Yeah. Well, you know, the thing of it is there's not a lot of information on exactly how they were made.
Yes.
So you go by photographs and read about them and do the best you can.
So why did World War I catch your attention, John?
Well, the reason I first started it was I had a 17 chassis, 1917 Ford chassis, and I started searching the internet to see what there was I could do with it. And I found a picture of an ambulance, a 1917 ambulance in front of a hospital with 2 soldiers and 3 nurses standing in the doorway of the hospital. And when I saw that, for some reason, I just fell in love with it and said, I got to have one of those. So that's what I built, was that ambulance. The ambulance drivers and the people who drove these, if they didn't know when they started, if they didn't know how to repair them, they learned pretty soon. Because practically every day there's just something that needs to be adjusted or fine-tuned or changed, a part changed on it or something. They were dependable, but they still required some time and babysitting, I guess you'd call it. That's a good one. In 1916 and 17, you had to crank them to start them. There was no other way. They didn't have electric starters on them. It's not a real popular old vehicle because it's so hard to drive. With the 3 pedals, I've been driving these for 13 years now. And in an emergency, I still have trouble stopping them. You feel what they felt when they drove. Not quite as much excitement because they had never, probably driven before, or if they had, it wasn't very much. And so this was top of the line, state of the art. I mean, they probably busted their buttons. I get to drive this thing now. I think that if you were to get in here and drive it a little bit, why then you'd be able to appreciate what the soldiers in World War I did.
The automobile became pretty prevalent at that time, and so I was assuming it changed warfare quite a bit, didn't it?
It took us from the horses and buggies and wagons to trucks and scout cars and ambulances, and they didn't get tired. They could go day and night, and they didn't have to change a team of horses all the time, and didn't require a lot of feed, just a few gallons of gas, and away they went,
There have been numerous times where I've been in Washington Park and went to the memorial and walked by it, and I know I looked at it, but it didn't have that much significance to me. I mean, I understood the sacrifice of those people who were involved in World War I, World War II, Korea, and all the battles since. now it has a distinctly different meaning to me. There's names of men who fought in the units that fought alongside my grandfathers, and looking at those names is going to have a totally different meaning for me now that I understand a little bit better about what they went through.
There was a small bridge at Consenvoy, but the Germans had managed to demolish most of it in their retreat.
These little towns in France, it really piques my interest. The more I'm getting into this, the more I'm desiring to possibly see where my grandfather actually was and where he fought. I'd really like to maybe even try to get over there to see the actual battlefields as opposed to seeing them on the maps. Just to be there on those battlefields would be just an excellent experience, emotional probably for me. I guess I came here today to try to make a little bit more of a connection as to the actual soldiers who participated in World War I with my grandfather.
They did a lot, they saw a lot. I mean, I think you know from your research that during the Meuse-Argonne, the 33rd was one of the most heavily gassed units.
The 33rd was shelled with gas every single day of the entire Meuse-Argonne campaign.
As I'm learning more about this story, I find myself growing closer to him.